Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is brought to you by the Star Quest Production Network and is made possible by our many generous patrons. If you'd like to support the podcast, please visit sqpn.com/give. You're listening to episode 352 of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, where we look at mysteries from the twin perspectives of faith and reason. In this episode, we're talking about the USS Hornet. I'm Dom Bettinelli, and joining me today is Jimmy Akin. Hey, Jimmy.
Howdy, Dom.
The USS Hornet is an American aircraft carrier that was in service between 1943 and 1970. It played an important role in the war in the Pacific during World War II, where it had a reputation for being an unusually lucky ship. It continued to play an important role during the Cold War, including during the Vietnam War and the space race. But there's much more to the story of the USS Hornet than meets the eye. What is the history of this fascinating ship? What should we know about it? And what mysteries are connected with it? That's what we'll be talking about on this episode of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. Jimmy, where do you want to begin today's mystery?
With a discussion of the Hornet's predecessors, though I will warn you that there are some twists that will be coming in this episode, so keep your ears peeled for those. Now, if you're a Star Trek fan, you'll know that they recycle ships' names. There have been multiple ships with the name Enterprise in Starfleet, beginning with the NX-01 in Star Trek Enterprise, then the ship designated NCC-1701 in Star Trek The Original Series, which was destroyed in Star Trek III, The Search for Spock, and replaced by the NCC-1701A Enterprise in Star Trek IV, The Search for Whales. By the time of the Next Generation, we were up to the 1701D, and the current Enterprise is 1701G, which was introduced in Picard Season 3. Well, they do the same thing in real life with ocean-going vessels. So prior to 1941, there had already been 6 ships in the U.S. Navy named Hornet. Then, just the month before the attack on Pearl Harbor that brought the U.S. into World War II, they commissioned the 7th Hornet, which bore the designation CV-8. CV stands for Cruiser Aviation or Cruiser Volaire, so it means that the Hornet was an aircraft carrier. In fact, it was a Yorktown-class carrier, and the number indicates that it was the 8th aircraft carrier in service. By the way, we discussed the Pearl Harbor attack and the conspiracy connected with it back in episode 184, so you can access that at mysterious.fm/184, and again the next week in episode 185 at mysterious.fm/185. So the Hornet CV-8 was commissioned in October 1941, just before America entered the war in December. And just a few months later, on April 18, 1942, the Hornet took part in the famous air raid on the Japanese capital, Tokyo. The raid was planned and led by Lieutenant Colonel James Jimmy Doolittle and is known as the Doolittle Raid. As an aircraft carrier, the Hornet carried aircraft that executed the raid. The raid didn't actually do a lot of damage to Tokyo, but it had major psychological effects on both sides of the Pacific. Here in the U.S., it showed the American people that despite the devastation that our Navy had suffered at Pearl Harbor, we were capable not only of striking the Japanese mainland, but the Japanese capital itself. Meanwhile, over in Japan, it showed the Japanese people that despite the devastation they had inflicted on the American Navy at Pearl Harbor, the Americans had recovered enough to be able to strike not only the Japanese mainland, but the Japanese capital itself. Suffice it to say, the Americans were elated and the Japanese were horrified. However, the raid didn't go as smoothly as planned. Although only 7 airmen died as a result of the raid, 15 of the 16 bombers that were involved were destroyed, and the remaining bomber was confiscated when it landed in the Soviet Union, which was not at war with Japan at the time. Because of the loss of the planes, Jimmy Doolittle believed that he would be court-martialed, but the effect of the raid on American morale was sufficient that they actually gave him a Medal of Honor, and he was promoted 2 ranks from lieutenant colonel to brigadier general, so good for him. Meanwhile, just 2 months later, in June 1942, what I will call the Hornet 8 participated in the Battle of Midway, which turned out to be the decisive battle in the war with Japan. We talked about the Battle of Midway back in episode 113 on the Kyujo incident, or desperate coup in Japan at the end of the war. You can go to mysterious.fm/113 to hear all about that. You see, many Japanese officers were supremely confident of Japan's ability to defeat the United States, but the commander-in-chief of the Imperial Navy, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, was not. He believed that given the immense population and natural resources America had at its disposal compared to Japan, there would be no way for the empire to win a lengthy war with the United States. He therefore proposed a short war. Japan would execute a sneak attack that would disable the American Navy in the Pacific for as much as a year. Then, while the Americans were rebuilding their Navy, Japan would conquer a bunch of places, and then they would negotiate a peace settlement with the United States. The first two parts of his plan went off as planned. The sneak attack on Pearl Harbor rendered the American Navy basically unable to project force for an extended period. During that time, Japan scored a bunch of victories, but the negotiated peace settlement didn't happen. It didn't take a year for America to build up its Navy to the point that it was making headway in the Pacific. It only took 7 months, and in June of 1942, American forces won the Battle of Midway and turned the tide in the Pacific theater. They did so by striking a major blow against the Imperial Navy at Midway. After this, Admiral Yamamoto concluded that the Japanese Navy had been irreparably damaged and that the war with America had been lost. It was only a matter of time now before the United States was victorious. However, the Hornet 8 would not see that victory. On October 26, 1942, just 1 year and 6 days after it was commissioned, the Hornet took part in the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, which are part of the Solomon Islands, and
then came the fatal day off the Santa Cruz Islands. A wave of 20 torpedo planes came boarding in. Aboard the carrier, with automatic controls wrecked, men are ramming ammunition into red-hot guns with bare hands to keep up their murderous fire. Near Guadalcanal, Hornet was hit by 2 torpedoes. Listing badly to port, the order came to abandon ship after the terrible intensity of an attack lasting 10 hours. In one last bid for life, they took her in tow. But as day faded, American destroyers had to right the end with torpedoes. The transfer of survivors from a destroyer to a cruiser traveling at speed. The wounded go first, slung across the boiling sea, racing like a cataract between the two ships. This was the epilogue to a brave story of the USS Hornet.
the USS Hornet, that is the CV-8, was the last American aircraft carrier sunk by enemy fire, at least as of 2024. Its wreckage was finally rediscovered in 2019 in waters almost 18,000 feet deep off the Solomon Islands.
So is that the background for the mystery today? Does it end with the Hornet 8 sitting on the bottom of the Pacific?
No, and here we come to the first of the twists in our story. Just like in Star Trek, if one ship gets destroyed, you may want to quickly replace it with another ship of the same name. Now, at this point in time, the U.S. was working on a new class of aircraft carriers. The Hornet 8 had been Yorktown class, but the American Navy was working on a new, larger class of carrier known as the Essex class. The first three of these had been ordered in May of 1940 as part of the arms race between America and Japan before we got into World War II. One of the new Essex-class carriers that was under construction in 1942 had been scheduled to be launched under the name USS Kearsarge, but when the Hornet 8 was sunk in October 1942, they quickly changed its name to Hornet to replace the lost ship. Its number was CV-12, the 12th aircraft carrier in the fleet. And so what I will call the Hornet 12 was commissioned on November 29, 1943, taking the place of its lost predecessor, which had done so much to boost morale in America and depress morale in Japan. The new Hornet was, of course, put back into service in the American Pacific Fleet, and a few months later, on March 15, 1944, it became the lead ship in the Pacific Fleet. It was under the command of Rear Admiral Joseph James Clark, also known as J.J. Clark and Jocko Clark. He was an interesting guy. He had been born in 1893 in what was then known as Indian Territory, though it's now known as Oklahoma. Specifically, Clark was born in the Cherokee Nation, which is just across the state line from where I live in northwest Arkansas, so I live within an hour there. And Admiral Clark was himself Cherokee. In fact, he was the first Native American to graduate from the U.S. Naval Academy, which happened in 1917. He also became the first Native American to receive the rank of admiral in the U.S. Navy, and according to the Oklahoma Hall of Fame,
Oklahoma's genuine Cherokee cowboy and one of America's greatest military leaders and champions of sea power, Admiral Joseph James Jocko Clark, was born near Pryor in Indian Territory in the Cherokee Nation and grew up near Chelsea, Oklahoma. He was sent to Willie Halsell College in Veneta and then to Oklahoma A&M, now Oklahoma State University, in Stillwater. Clark graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy in 1917 and received his Naval Aviator Wings in 1925. He became one of the most renowned admirals of World War II, often referred to as the Patton of the Pacific and the Korean conflict. A guided missile frigate, the USS Clark, was named in his honor and commissioned in 1980. During the Korean conflict, he was an astute fleet commander and introduced close air support measures that became known as Cherokee strikes. He retired as a full admiral from the U.S. Navy in 1953 and was posthumously inducted into the Cherokee Hall of Fame in Tahlequah.
Admiral Clark passed on to his reward in 1971 at the age of 77, but during the last year and a half of World War II, he was serving as the commander of the Pacific Fleet, with the Hornet serving as his flagship, meaning he was in charge of it. Unlike on Star Trek, a flagship is the ship that carries the flag officer or admiral who is in charge of a fleet or a fleet subdivision, and it flies the commander's flag, hence the name. So the Hornet 12 was serving an extremely important function in the war with Japan, and it did extremely well. In fact, it had a reputation of being extremely lucky. Despite being under enemy attack 59 times, it was never directly struck by enemy fire, despite often being in waters mere miles from Japan. As a result, none of the crew died from enemy fire while they were on board. The only deaths that occurred were either due to accidents or when crewmen were off the ship. 30 of its 42 pilots achieved the status of being flying aces, meaning they'd shot down 5 or more enemy aircraft, and 10 of them made ace in a day status, meaning they shot down those 5 in a single day and thus qualified as aces. They were also part of some very dramatic events that happened on board the ship. For example, on October 14th, 1944, Ensign Ted Lepianka had to make an emergency landing on the Hornet, despite the fact he had no functional landing gear. And the footage that we'll have of this event in the video version of the podcast is really dramatic. Lepianka basically had to approach the ship and land on its flight deck despite the fact he couldn't lower his landing gear. You can see that the bottom of his plane is just smooth with the landing gear up, and the plane skids and twists to a stop on the flight deck. The propellers of the plane strike the surface of the deck and become completely bent. Then everyone rushes up to help him get him out of the plane and keep it from catching on fire. Of course, the plane was ruined and they had to throw it overboard, but despite being wounded by enemy fire, Ensign Lepianka survived and returned to duty. Incidentally, the Hornet 12 itself has the radio call sign The Gray Ghost, and its phenomenal luck led some people to propose, maybe half-jokingly, that it was being protected by the spirits of the crew that had died aboard the Hornet 8. It was like the crew of the 8 were making sure that the misfortune that happened to their ship didn't happen to the 12.
What happened to the Hornet after the war?
Well, there wasn't a need to maintain as many aircraft carriers since we weren't in an active war situation, and so the Hornet was temporarily decommissioned in 1947, upon which it was assigned to the Pacific Reserve Fleet. It was then renovated and modernized, and it was recommissioned in 1971. The Hornet played a role in the Korean War, which had begun in 1950 and which continued through 1953. After the Korean War, it also played a role in the Vietnam War, which America became involved in during the 1960s, and it played a special role in the Apollo missions to our sister planet, the Moon. And yes, we will be having a future episode on the issue of whether the moon landings were real or not. Basically, in July of 1969, the Hornet was assigned to retrieve the crew of the Apollo 11 mission, the first mission that took men to the moon. But shortly before splashdown occurred, a major problem developed.
Apollo 11 Houston, did you copy? Over.
The Apollo 11 crew blazes back to Earth at 6,000 miles per hour. In Houston, mission controllers prepare to celebrate the return of the world's first lunar landing. At Hickam Air Force Base, Air Force meteorologists in a top-secret spy program know something NASA doesn't. Mother Nature plans to greet the three American heroes with a powerful storm.
There were folks in the military who were looking at where the Apollo 11 landing site was and knew that there was a typhoon heading that way at about the time the crew was going to be there.
Air Force meteorologists have no choice but to break rank. Sitting on the classified intelligence could prove to be a national disaster.
They managed to find a way to discreetly tell NASA that we can't tell you how we know this, but there is this weather storm coming and you might want to move the splashdown site for Apollo 11.
So they managed to get NASA to change the splashdown coordinates, and
on July 24th, Apollo 11 bursts through the atmosphere. As its parachutes deploy, the crew is met with clear skies and a calm sea. President Nixon waits on board the USS Hornet to welcome the astronauts back to Earth. Few people know just how close the crew came to a watery grave. The near disaster provides a sobering lesson. NASA engineers may be able to challenge the laws of physics, but nature will always be there to flex her muscles.
Mother Nature is not to be messed with, and weather can impinge on space operations in lots and lots of different ways.
In just 4 months, the American space program will be tested by nature once more.
at the end of that video, you can see President Nixon talking with the Apollo 11 astronauts who were inside what was called the Mobile Quarantine Facility, which was basically a converted Airstream travel trailer like you'd hitch to your car to go on vacation. Its purpose was to quarantine the astronauts in the Apollo missions after they'd been out on the surface of the moon. It was considered unlikely that there were any moon germs that could infect them, but just in case there were, they were quarantined inside the trailer for 3 weeks after they got back to Earth, lest the plot of Michael Crichton's 1969 novel, The Andromeda Strain, happen in real life. But they successfully retrieved the crew of Apollo 11, and then 4 months later, in November 1969, they did it all again with Apollo 12. Only this time the landing was rough, and one of the astronauts, Alan Bean, was injured.
Go ahead. Roger, the Hornet is on station, just far enough off the target point to keep from getting hit.
Hornet reports a sonic boom a short time ago.
I'm in Houston, and the blind air boss has a visual contact.
One of my jobs, sitting in the right-hand seat with a little window in front of me, was to take a 16mm camera and mount it in the window. After the main chutes came out, take and dismount the camera and set it in a bag next to my seat. During the entry, everything went as planned, but somehow I got behind the checklist, and when it came time to dismount the camera, for some reason, I decided not to take it off the bracket and put it in the bag. When we hit the water, that camera and bracket came off the mount, which I didn't know it would do, but such a hit, and it hit me right here. In fact, I thought that if that thing had hit me in the middle of the head, it might have killed me, because it really came off there. And fortunately, it hit me a glancing blow, and apparently it knocked me a little unconscious. It was luck, because I think if I'd had a little bad luck, I could have gotten killed right there just because I didn't follow the checklist.
Fortunately, Astronaut Bean and the others ended up fine, and after these triumphs, it was time for the USS Hornet to be officially retired. It was decommissioned in 1970, and it was stored in the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard up in Washington State. In 1991, the Hornet was designated as a National Historic Landmark, but despite being designated a historic landmark, a charity had not been able to raise enough money to purchase it. And in 1993, it was actually planned to be sold off as scrap at a price of just $6 per ton of metal, or $13 after all the inflation the government has caused since 1993. It would be a while before it would be scrapped, however, and in 1995, the ship got a temporary reprieve. It was sent to the Naval Air Station Alameda in Alameda, California on San Francisco Bay to be part of the celebration of the history of that station, which was itself going to be closed. So I guess that's no longer where they store the nuclear vessels. The ceremonies performed aboard the ship caused new interest in saving the Hornet from being scrapped, and a new charity, the aircraft carrier USS Hornet Foundation, came into existence. They needed to raise the money to purchase it and get it cleaned up and get it fitted out to be a museum. But it wasn't at all clear that they would be able to accomplish all this. At first, it wasn't even certain that they'd be able to get the ship from the Navy, but as part of this process, they had access to and were working on the ship. And it's at this point that we hit a second and larger twist in our story. It started slow and then picked up steam. Author Margaret Murray writes about the experiences of Alan McCain, one of the founding trustees of the Hornet Foundation, and also the experiences of Bob Rogers, the director of marketing in the 1990s. She states,
"Some volunteers feel the ship as a whole has a personality and spirit of her own. Alan McCain said, if you're in the Navy long enough, you realize that ships and boats have a way of talking to you. It's either a happy ship, you get good vibes, or you don't. This is a happy ship." Bob Rogers tells of a time in 1995 when the volunteers were very discouraged whether the Navy would release the Hornet to them. He made a call and straightened the problem out. When he returned and got out of the car, Bob felt the ship was smiling at him.
So these officials felt that they were picking up emotional energies from the ship as if it had a personality of its own. But this wasn't all. Other strange things started happening too. For example, here's a volunteer on the Hornet named Ron Todd who serves as a tour guide, and he describes an event that happened in 1995 to another volunteer named Derek. It also involves what's known as a dogging wrench, which is a kind of wrench that you use to tighten the dogs or handles that seal a watertight door.
And then I talked about the dogging wrench and the watertight door. These handles are called dogs. And by every watertight door was stowed a dogging wrench. The dogging wrench slips over the dogs, so the handles could be torqued down even tighter. And in '95, Derek, one of our volunteers, offered to act as security if the two gates were locked and he was aboard by himself. He was walking this hangar bay about 12:30 at night, very dimly lit, and all of a sudden he heard this sound. Derek will not stay aboard the Hornet by himself again.
So not too much to that story. Derek is there late at night. He hears a dog and wrench fall, and it scares him, so he won't stay aboard the ship alone after that. But this was only the beginning. In early summer of 1995, a more dramatic event occurred, and it also involved a dog and wrench. Here's Keith Ledoux, who began working on the Hornet in 1995, and in June of 1999, when this interview was filmed, he was the overnight supervisor. As part of his duties, he would live on board the ship as security.
Okay, this is the quarterdeck and this is the captain's ladder. Back in 1995, we had a small working party aboard the ship when the ship was still being borrowed by the Navy while it was on scrapping contract just for the legacy of the base. You know, it was going to close in a couple of years, so the Navy borrowed the ship for 5 months. We had a souvenir stand set up right over here, so the Navy asked a few of us to stay on board to watch the stuff from the ship and then watch the ship. And we had all retired. I think there was 5 of us on board. We had all retired to our berthing area, which is up forward. And I guess it was around 1 or 2 in the morning. We heard a dogging pipe, which you might have that, you know, that sound is very distinct, it's very loud. Go out. Then we heard footsteps come at this ladder. Now this ladder makes a distinctive sound. Has some very light metal steps on it. I'll give you a little demonstration. Can you catch this over here? We knew it was this ladder. Okay, we all started knocking on each other's stateroom doors. We all congregated. Did you hear that? We all agreed that we heard that, so we came out here to investigate. Now, a few hours before, we had just completed painting this quarterdeck. There was a charcoal gray colored paint. It was 12-hour paint. It was still wet. We came out here, we touched the paint, it was still wet. There was no footprints going through the paint up to the captain's ladder. That's the only way to get to that. There's no other way. If someone went up the captain's ladder, they would have had to gone through the paint on the quarterdeck to get there. And there was no footsteps in the paint. Nothing. That paint was still wet. We stuck our fingers in it. It was still wet. And they had to go through that area to get up that ladder.
Now, this was Keith's first experience on the ship, and it's more involved than the initial one we heard about. The men aboard the ship heard a dog and wrench drop, and then they heard steps going up the captain's ladder. But the freshly painted floor didn't show any footprints. Still, this was just hearing things go bump in the night, but something more than that was involved in Keith's second experience, which would take place that summer in August of 1995. Unlike the first 2 we heard about, this one did not take place at night, but at 2 o'clock in the afternoon.
The second experience I had was in August of '95, and I was in charge of a 9-person working party on the ship. It was in the afternoon. This is after we had locked up a lot of areas on the ship, so there was only one way into them and one way out. And I was in charge of the tours on the ship and teach tour guides, orientate them how to run tours on the ship. Up in the gallery deck, which is right up underneath the flight deck, there's a whole deck up there, and it's like there's a lot looks like catacombs. There was an old flag briefing room which had blue movie theater chairs, and they used to take dignitaries and high-ranking, Navy brass up there to orientate them. So I had this area, and I go, well, I'm going to go up there and start cleaning it up and fix the desk up and clean the chairs off so I can get it set up to use it. While I was up there walking down the passageways in the gallery, there was no lights. I had a flashlight. Started walking down the passageway, and I heard a voice, and it was saying, over here, come here. This is after we had one way in here and one way out. Everything else was locked up. It was dark here. There was no lights. I was here with a flashlight. I was coming through this area here. I was walking forward. Over here, come here. I go, well, that's odd. Someone's playing a trick on me. Okay, wait a minute now. There's one way in here and one way out, but someone else must be in here with me doing this. And I believe in ghosts, but I'm skeptical. I got to find out for sure it's not someone playing a trick on me. So I walked into the area that's the area in and out, and there was no one around. I looked through compartments. No one was around. I kept hearing, over here, come here, over here, come here. And I stopped again. And I heard it again, over here, come here, over here, come here. So I started, banging with my dogging pipe, and there's some chains hanging. I was trying to duplicate the sound. And I could not duplicate the sound. So I stood in the middle of the passageway for a minute. Oh, this is interesting. And it's pitch black. This is about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, by the way. I stood for a minute and I started walking forward a little bit, and I heard it again. Over here, come here. Over here, come here. So okay, that kind of startled me a little bit. So I went back over here. And I was working in here. So I was originally used this as a tour guide office. This is back long before we got the ship, and we didn't know what was going on. So I came in for a minute and I heard it again. Over here, come here. Over here, come here. So I got out of here and went back out to the quarterdeck, and everybody was there. The other 8 people were all present, accounted for, near the quarterdeck area of the ship. Now there's a little more to that story. When one of our directors or trustees was asking former crew members about if they had any kind of supernatural experiences on board, one of the guys was saying, yeah, well, during an open house, I had my girlfriend on board, and we were up in the gallery deck on the port side of the ship. It was around 2:30 in the afternoon. We heard a voice say, over here, come here. And he had never heard my story.
So in this experience, we have an audible human voice. It's not just the sound of a dogging wrench dropping or what sound like footsteps on a ladder. The voice says the same thing over and over. Keith tried to duplicate the sound naturally and couldn't. He verified that none of the other people on the ship were in the area, and he learned that 32 years earlier in 1963, a crewman had had the same experience. He also heard a voice saying, over here, come here. It was in the same part of the ship, the gallery deck, and it was at the same time of day in the mid-afternoon. All of that makes it sound like this is what is known as a haunting, but that doesn't mean what you might suppose. The term haunting has a technical meaning in parapsychology, which we'll talk about next week.
By this point, with the volunteers having multiple experiences like this, the Hornet was starting to get a reputation as being a haunted ship, but so far all the experiences have just involved the sense of hearing. Did it stay that way?
No, and to hear about another completely different kind of experience, let's hear from the Hornet Foundation's director of marketing in the 1990s, a man named Bob Rogers. And he had heard rumors about strange things happening on the ship.
My personal experience where I really became aware of Hornet's ghost story, so to speak, was when we were locking the ship up during the time period that the Navy allowed us to save her. We didn't have access to the ship, and we wanted to lock up our engineering spaces because there's some very valuable and attractive dials and gauges and equipment there that people love for souvenirs, for family rooms and so forth. So we wanted to make certain she was protected. And there's 8 engineering spaces. And during the 4 months preceding the time we locked the ship up, I'd been all over the ship, and every time I found chain, I would collect it because we were always trying to lock it up better than we had it before. It's a huge ship, and there was just a lot to lock. So, and to close off permanently. And as I would go around the ship, I would pick up chain, and I had been on the second and third decks a number of times, and there was no chain left because I had picked up every piece of chain I could find during the 4 months preceding the time that we were going to lock it up now while we were meeting the Navy's requirements to acquire the ship. There's 8 engineering spaces, and when we started to lock them up, we ran out of chain after 2 spaces. There's actually 4. Each space has 2 hatches in a regular way than an emergency escape route. And so we had locked up 4 hatches, and we were, at that point, I'd run out of chain, and I was going to go back up and get some chain. I didn't have an awful lot left, but I started to walk away from the fellows that were there, and I said, "Hornet, give us chain." And I was just joshing basically, and I said, "Hornet, give us chain." And I walked down a passage and around a bend, and in a corner is a pile of brand new chain, and I thought, I don't remember this here, but I thought, well, I must have just walked by it and never saw it. So I picked it up and brought it back, and we locked that space, and we went on to the next space, and I did this jokingly again, "Hornet, give us chain," walked off again down a passage, and and around several corners, and sure enough, I found some more chain. And it was brand new chain. We brought it back. Then one of the other parties that was with me said, I'll go get chain this time, and he says, Hornet, give us chain. And the long and the short of it is that we found chain 6 times to lock up the ship in an area that I'd gone through maybe 100 times, picking up everything I could find.
They said it was new chain?
It was brand new chain.
So it was sparkly, shiny?
Sparkly, shiny, bright, like it was right out of the store. And I had not seen any chain like that around the ship. The chain that was on the ship at a minimum was 27, 28 years old. It was not necessarily corroded, but it wasn't shiny at all.
So despite the fact that Bob had collected all of the old faded chain from this part of the ship, they made 6 requests for chain, and each time brand new sparkling chain would be found. In parapsychological terms, this would be known as apportation. Apportation occurs when objects mysteriously appear, and if this was genuine apportation, something that didn't have a natural cause, it would involve more than just the physical sense of hearing that we've covered so far. This one would also involve a physical object that you could touch and handle.
Hearing and touch are important human senses, but our primary sense is vision. Did anyone ever see anything mysterious?
Yes, and here's Keith Ledoux again.
Okay, this is the forecastle. That's short for forecastle. This is the anchor chain windlass room. This is where they keep the anchor chain machinery and the anchor chains themselves. The chain lockers are forward. When me and Jim were in here painting last year, he was facing that direction, and I was facing this direction painting, and I saw 2 figures standing up here, one in khakis and one in work blues. I turned around and said, Jim, do you see that officer and that enlisted guy standing up there? He goes, turns around, I don't see anybody. They were gone in a split second, but I saw them and I wasn't suffering from paint fumes.
So in this experience, Keith saw 2 crew members standing on a catwalk in the forecastle, and this appears not to have just been something he saw in his mind's eye, because he asked his fellow workmen if he saw them too. So it looks like Keith at least thought that he was perceiving them with his physical eyes, which is the way many apparitions manifest, as an apparently physical image, even though it's really mental. In this case, it looked like one was an officer wearing khakis and one was a crewman wearing work blues. But they were only there for a moment, and when Keith looked back, they had vanished. As we'll soon hear, this was far from the only time that people saw visible apparitions.
And before we get to those, we do want to stop and take a moment to thank our patrons who make this show possible, including Mike R., Betty K., Ronald W., Walter C., and Margaret G. Their generous donations at sqpn.com/give make it possible for us to continue Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World and all the shows at StarQuest, and you can join them by visiting sqpn.com/give. Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is also brought to you by DeliverContacts.com, offering top brand contact lenses at always low prices with free delivery. Visit DeliverContacts.com. And by The Grady Group, a Catholic company bringing financial clarity to their clients across the United States, using safe money options to produce reasonable rates of return for their clients. Learn more at GradyGroupInc.com. Jimmy, with all these strange experiences starting to happen on board the ship, did they think to call in any paranormal investigators?
Yes, and this happened in stages. As a first stage, they allowed several psychics to come on board and see what impressions they got of the ship. One of these was a psychic named Stash Margaret Murray, or Stash for short. She began investigating in February of 1998, and we heard a section of something that she wrote earlier. But here she speaks about her first impressions, including her perception that the ship itself seems to have a spirit.
What was your first experience when you came on board? First time you came on board?
Immediately, I could detect that the ship had a spirit of its own. Very, very large, powerful force. That was very, very striking to me.
Tell us about the spirits of the men themselves, though.
Additionally, when I came on board, immediately I saw, standing in Hangar Bay 2, a commander. He was in dress whites, and I saw the chaplain, as well as a medical officer. In the rear, there was, farther off, there was an admiral in dress whites, and then there was several servicemen, sailors, I suppose. They were in white uniforms. Behind them and surrounding them were some individuals that were in the blues, and that was my first.
Now, because Stash is a psychic, we should understand her as describing her mental impressions of the ghost she received. So this should be different than what Keith thought he saw with his physical eyes. Vivid apparitions like that are reported, but most of the time psychics are describing things that they're picking up mentally, and they're not thinking that they're getting the information with their physical eyes. But what Stash saw in her first experience was a whole bunch of ghosts. She saw a commander, the chaplain, a medical officer, an admiral, several sailors in whites, and some others that were in work blues. So this was sounding quite different than the normal experience in which ghosts appear. Usually a house or a business will have one ghost appearing, but here it sounds like there was a whole ghost community aboard the Hornet, which is one of the reasons I wanted to cover this on Mysterious World. Stash also got impressions that confirmed those of other psychics who looked at the ship. You'll recall that earlier we got a story from tour guide Ron Todd, who told us about another volunteer named Derek and how he was scared by a dog and wrench that fell when he was on the ship alone at night. Well, here's what a psychic named Norma Dove had to say about that.
Norma Dove, when I tell the guests this story, she says that there's always one, if not two spirits, standing beside me or behind me, laughing because they're the ones that threw the dogging wrench.
And Stash's impressions agreed with Norma's.
I think they enjoy the fact you're telling the story, and they're getting a chuckle out of it. So that's why they're always listening.
They're always here.
So I feel them on either side listening.
Does it feel cool to you other than the hatch being open?
I know what you mean. It is cooler. But they are around. They're right here because they love that story. They think that's hilarious. And you'll notice, you'll probably feel guys out on a fantail, and it's part of them, but there's also other guys out in the fantail too.
Okay.
You get more than one out there.
Yes, I've felt that on occasion. Not always, but on occasion I've felt a presence. Again, not like the shadows, but practical jokers.
Yeah, they're more relaxing, smoking and hanging out over there.
Right.
Yeah, but definitely these guys, they're kind of listening in, and then they're laughing. They're laughing as soon as they hear the story. Every time they start laughing, they're very impressed with themselves.
We'll hear more from Stash as we go along, but first I want to relate a couple of incidents that didn't involve her that also happened in 1998. The first was another visual sighting that happened in the late fall of that year, and it involved Keith Ledoux, who we've already heard from. It also involved another worker named Jim Yushenkov, and it's worth noting that Jim was a bit older, and he had actually served aboard the Hornet in the late 1960s before it was decommissioned. But now he was working for the Hornet Foundation when this interview was made in June of 1999. And it's also worth noting that Jim is a skeptic who did not believe in ghosts.
This is a recent sighting, late fall last year. We were up in the forecastle. It's called the forecastle for short, where the anchor chain windlass room is, where the anchor, lifting, dropping machinery is. And me and one of the buddies on the ship that I work with had just got through doing that. We went to his stateroom to relax for a little bit, and we had the porthole open that goes out to a passageway running alongside of it. And he doesn't believe in ghosts, and he says, when I see one, I'll believe it. We were sitting there talking. We both happened to be facing that direction toward the porthole, and we saw something whiz by, and what it was a young man's head, close-cropped haircut, military fashion. He turns around to me, he goes, did you see that? I go, yes, I did. And we went, whoa. We both took turns looking at the porthole. There was nothing there. There was no footsteps, no nothing. It was not a bird. Now, if someone was running down that passageway, you would hear him. Was it steel? So that kind of startled us, and I call it the whiz now. I tell people about it. That's my nickname for it. It went really fast, but you could definitely make it out a young man's face and a military close crop haircut.
Now, here is Jim Yushinkov's testimony about the same event, which he describes for us in the room where it took place.
One evening, after the ship closed, me and Keith Ledoux, a friend of mine, were sitting here. He was sitting in that chair right there. I was sitting in this chair here, facing this direction, when all of a sudden we see a head go by this porthole. And we both looked at each other and said, "Did you see that?" Nobody was supposed to be aboard the ship at that time. He said, "Yeah," so I get up quickly and look out to see if I can find this person. There's nobody out there. That in itself isn't unusual. What is unusual is that we did not hear a single sound. This guy was close-cropped hair, young, clean-shaven, looked like he was probably naval personnel. But I didn't recognize him. And nobody was supposed to be aboard the ship at that time, except for us. And that's all I saw.
So Jim, who does not believe in ghosts, nevertheless confirmed that he also saw the head of the whiz go past the porthole quickly, that he looked like he was military personnel, that there wasn't supposed to be anyone else on the ship, and that the two of them did not hear any noise as he went running by. Keith also went with the camera crew to the hallway that the whiz ran down.
Now, when we saw the head go down the passageway, me and Jim both noted we were sitting in this stateroom here. I was on the bunk bed, sitting on the bottom bunk. Jim was sitting over here. We saw the head come through very fast, and Jim turned around and said, "Did you see that?" I go, "Yes, I did." Now, you look where you were standing. See all the combings on the deck here. If someone was running through here that fast, they would have to make noise. There's no way anybody alive or in physical form come through here without making noise.
Jim also ran down the corridor to demonstrate what he and Keith saw and should have heard when the whiz went by.
That's what we should have heard.
So this was a strange experience, particularly because the whiz went by without making any noise. Another strange visual sighting occurred in December of 1998 when there was a Christmas tree on board. And Keith mentions that this one happened at night, which is when people assume ghostly encounters happen, as if darkness was necessary for them to take place, but that's absolutely not true. In fact, most ghostly encounters happen during the day, which Keith notes is true of his onboard experience on the ship.
All the experiences I've had, except for this one, have generally been in the afternoon. Well, one of the crew members that was staying overnight, one of the volunteers, we were going down via flashlight to go out and get something to eat, and this was when the whole ship was blacked out. And there was a 15-foot Christmas tree in between Hangar Bay 1 and Hangar Bay 2, and it went up to the overhead. It was really tall. Okay, December of last year, we had a party on board, a Christmas party, and we had a 15-foot Christmas tree in Hangar Bay 1. Me and Bruce is one of the volunteers. We're coming down here, this ladder here. He was ahead of me, and as we were walking down the ladder, just before we stepped onto the hangar deck, we saw a figure run into the Christmas tree, and they were wearing a naval uniform. From what I can make out, you know, the white sailor's lid and the pea coat. The Christmas tree is right about where that lift is there, that guy's sitting on, and we saw someone run into it. And I asked the guy next to me, "Did you see it?" "Yeah." And we went over there and investigated. There was no one there. They went right inside of the tree. And well, let's go investigate. We went over there, and this only took a half a minute. We investigated the whole perimeter. There was nothing there. There was nothing in the Christmas tree. I kind of figured the apparition or the spirit, the reason they ran into the Christmas tree is they hadn't seen a Christmas tree in like 30 years on this ship, so it kind of made them feel closer to home, and they dashed into it. I think one of the presences aboard was delighted to see a Christmas tree. It's been a long time.
So they checked out the area. There was no one near the tree or inside the tree. And Keith's theory that the ghost of a sailor might be moved by the sight of a Christmas tree after all these years and rush into it, either because he was moved by emotion or possibly because he realized he'd just been spotted, is interesting. Now, we just heard from Jim Yushinkov, a skeptic who didn't believe in ghosts, but he wasn't the only skeptic to witness something strange. Another was the Hornet Foundation's Director of Development and Museum, Alan McKean. His experience occurred when he was escorting some officials from the Coca-Cola company around the ship, and it occurred in what's known as the island, which is the command center that sits on top of an aircraft carrier's flight deck. Mr. McKean had also heard the stories about ghostly experiences on the ship, and in his words, he gave them a little bit of salt, meaning he took them with a grain of salt and didn't believe them.
Well, I didn't give them any credence whatsoever. You know, I'm not really a believer in this, but at the same time, I know what you're alluding to, and I had heard, you know, different things like Bob Rogers with he and Pete with chains being left in various places for them, you know, and doors shutting, and other people knowing and having had experiences on the third deck, and so you listen to it and you give it a little bit of salt, and that's okay. But then again, what I saw, I have no real explanation for, except I saw it, and I'm not necessarily a believer in the paranormal. There may well be something out there, but at the same time, I'm not necessarily a believer in it. But again, I mean, I saw what I saw, and the other gentleman who was with me saw the same thing. Mark Alba and I were standing exactly where you and I are standing right now. Two other fellows with Coca-Cola had been speaking with us, and they went around through that hatch and were going out into the outer bridge. So Mark and I were standing here talking, and we both looked over here, and there was a gentleman in khaki with an overseas hat on, with a short-sleeved khaki shirt, full uniform, standing right there at the top of the ladder. And as I explained, he turned around and looked over his shoulder and went right down the ladder. And so I said, "Excuse me, Mark." And he said, "Sure, go ahead, Alan." And so I walked over to the ladder and went down the ladder and tried to go ahead and find him. And essentially that's what happened. So I went down the ladder, but before I went down the ladder, he was standing here exactly like this, just like this, and he looked right over at me, just like that, and went down the ladder. And I went down the ladder after him. And I didn't find anybody. And I went all the way down to the next ladder, all the way down to the flight deck, and looked on the flight deck, and there was nobody there. And called down the next ladder down, there was nobody there, nor was there anyone in the escalator. And I have no explanation. I don't think any human being can move that quickly. So I have no explanation for it, except that's exactly what happened.
So Mr. McKean is a skeptic of the paranormal, but he reports that he and the other gentleman saw a man who was apparently one more of the naval crew members wearing khakis descend in a ladder from the island and then seemingly vanished. And he didn't think that any normal person could move that fast. Another experience like this occurred in January of 1999, and it involved Bob Rogers, the Hornet Foundation's director of marketing in the 1990s.
About 3 months ago, I was on a Saturday morning going down to main control, which is the main engineering space. And I was going down to see how the restoration was coming along. And it was very quiet down on the third deck. And the lights were just approximately like this. All of these lights may not have been on in the passageway, though, come to think of it. The passage was fairly dark, and the electrical shop, which is off to the right here, had all the lights out in it. So when I came here to the edge, I could look down, and you can with the camera right from here, and you can see the lower ladder that actually goes into the engine room itself. So in that situation, what I had was a darkened passage here. There was a little bit of light, but it was basically dark. And when I looked down, I could see a man right down here on the next ladder in a khaki uniform come around as if he was going ahead of me, and it just turned the corner and started down the next ladder, and it had to be either a chief petty officer or an officer, because they'd be the ones that wear khaki uniforms. So I went down the ladder like this, turned the light on, and continued on down into the engine room. And this is just the way I saw the person come, as if they were ahead of me coming down the ladder and then turning here and down this ladder. And when I got into the engine room, there was no one here. I turned on all the lights in this space and really looked through it very thoroughly, and even went to the lower level, which we won't do today because there's 2 levels in this space, in this engineering space. But I went all around all the equipment to the lower level, around the equipment on the lower level, and there was no one in here. And I heard there was no sound, incidentally, of that person. I could just look down and I could see them as if they were ahead of me, and they sort of came around into my view, then went down the next ladder. I could see them coming into this space, and then when I got here, there was no one here.
So Bob Rogers also saw an unexplained historical figure going down a ladder, and he wasn't the only one. These interviews that we've been hearing from were made in June of 1999, and Keith Ledoux had also experienced something similar at the time.
Since I've talked to you last a couple of days ago, I had an experience, and I haven't had one in the ship for around 6 months. It was Sunday night. I was coming out of my stateroom, and the red lights were on here. I walked out here, and I just saw a form move really fast down that ladder here. Now, right before this had happened, I heard someone go into the men's head over here, which is the restroom. So I kind of figured it wasn't that person there. I didn't hear any footsteps, and when I came over here to go investigate, I just got really cold, real cold. My hair just stood straight up. So I went, oh, okay, this is interesting. I walked over here, and one of the crew members was in the bathroom. I asked him if he was just there. Did he go down that ladder? He goes, no. I came in the bathroom a few minutes ago, and I was in here. Like I said, there was no footsteps, and I came over here and got the real cold chill, and my hair just stood straight up in my arms.
So Keith also saw an unclear form of some kind go down a ladder. When he investigated, he felt cold, and nobody could explain it.
We get a series of events that seem to involve ghosts repeatedly going down ladders. What would explain this?
I think it's the fact that ladders are common on ships like this. So it's common for sailors to move up and down them between decks. And if ghosts are on board the Hornet and reenacting the kind of things they did during life, or doing new things for that matter, then they might use the ladders. And sometimes you might psychically perceive them as doing so. Alternately, these might be hauntings, that is, imprints left behind by sailors going up and down the ladders back when they were alive and on the ship. And people are psychically picking up on these imprints now.
Paranormal investigators, and not just the goofy ones on ghost hunting shows, but actual competent ones, often bring psychics to scenes of paranormal activities. Why do they do that?
On the theory that if someone is psychically sensitive, then they can serve as a kind of human sensor. Ordinary people with low levels of psychic ability may be able to pick up on some things that are going on in an environment, but if someone is a trained psychic with more substantial ability, they may be able to pick up on more about that environment, and so they can add to the pool of data to consider.
Does that mean that what a psychic says is just automatically accepted as true?
No. One of the things that is quite clear from laboratory research is that if humans have psychic abilities, they aren't 100% reliable. There's always a mixture of noise or inaccurate information that psychics pick up on. And psychics who are honest and self-aware will acknowledge this fact. However, not all self-professed psychics are good ones. Some actually have very little ability and are fooling themselves about how good they are. And some are outright frauds who are fooling other people. So I can't speak to what happens on goofy ghost hunting shows, but among competent paranormal investigators, what a psychic says is not simply treated as if it's gospel.
How do you tell the good psychics from the bad ones?
One way is by looking at their prior track record. In other words, have they been able to come up with good, accurate information in the past? Another way is by testing them on the current location. For example, if they walk around the site, do they detect activity in the same places that the witnesses saw, heard, and felt things? If the psychics and the witnesses haven't talked about where the activity occurs, and there's a match between where the psychic detects it and where the witnesses saw it, then that's evidence that they're both picking up on the same thing. Another kind of test is if in an environment like the Hornet, the psychic can pick up on some of what used to be done in a particular area, what kind of jobs, even though there aren't visible clues that would tell you about those jobs. That's also evidence that the psychic is picking up on stuff from the environment. For example, here, Stash Margaret Murray describes how she convinced officials of the USS Hornet Foundation that she was genuinely picking up on things.
When I first came on board as a psychic, there were the director of marketing, director of events, director of exhibits, and their administrative staff with me. And we went through and had a tour. They were very supportive and very open, especially when, not knowing anything about the ship, I could identify areas that the activities were precisely what would have been happening in those places.
If psychics like Stash Murray were able to shed light on what was happening on the Hornet, what did they discover?
One of the things they reported was information about who they perceived the ghost to be. And it turned out that they didn't just see former crew members of the Hornet 12. There were also crew members from the Hornet 8. Stash Murray reports,
It was very clear to me, as I said, there were spirits from a prior ship, and but very closely related to this one. Well, it was the predecessor. It was the CV-8. This is the Hornet CV-12. It was their predecessor that was involved in the Doolittle raid on Tokyo, Japan, and later, unfortunately, sunk. The CV-12 was named to avenge her predecessor, and that she did. She became known as the Lucky Lady. After being under attack 59 times, never hit by a bomb, torpedo, or kamikaze pilot, it was clear that this was a special ship. I had, again, no knowledge of this, but when I came on board, immediately could pick up that there were definitely servicemen from both ships.
This included the identification of a particular ghost.
The spirits that I have seen on here, many of them are from the World War II era. Specifically and very present is a Rear Admiral, Commander J.J. Clark, and he keeps quite a good eye on the ship. He seems to be very meticulous and detailed. Not only does he give orders or duty to the crew, but he checks up on it. He wants to see what's going on too. There are also a couple of officers that I have seen that are in khakis that walk around, pretty much surveying any kind of activity on the ship. There are, in the ladies' room, it's currently now the ladies' room, but when I first came on board, it was an engine repair room. And in that room, there were two crew members. One was, I name him Jake. He's heavy-set, tattooed arms, big guy, very hardworking, but also a practical joker, and likes getting a lot of laughs. He's accompanied by a smaller crew member, smaller in size, but the two of those tend to be very active with the practical jokes, as well as making sure that things are taken care of on the ship. And more recently, I've seen another crew member in that area as well that accompanies them. He's a younger serviceman. Predominantly, it's in the 40s that I have seen the ghosts and spirits have predominantly been from that time frame. However, there are some after and earlier.
So Stash perceived a variety of individual ghosts, including J.J. Clark, the admiral who had been in charge of the ship during World War II. She also perceived ghosts on the ship from both before and after World War II. Bob Ross also had thoughts on who the ghosts are and why they're on the ship.
I think they're former crew members. I think they are crew members that have come back to the ship, or perhaps they were killed on the ship, or they died on the ship, or they're, in some instances, I think some of them probably died after the war and after their service on the ship, but for some reason came back. Retiring here, yes. Because what you find is that people love to come back to the ship. And even today, as you walk around the ship, our volunteers are many former sailors, and not only on this ship, but other ships, and they love to come back here. Some are Army people that were in the other services, but they look back at their youthful years, and they realize this was a wonderful experience. Now, the war wasn't a wonderful experience, but they look back, and it was a time in the life they'd like to relive, and so it's kind of fun for them to come back onto the ship and feel once again the way they did when they're young.
And that seems reasonable to me. I know one of the things I'd like to do in the afterlife is revisit some of the places I went in life. I'd even like to time travel and observe things as they were during different periods of my life. In fact, I'd love to time travel right now and visit places and things from my childhood and early adulthood, only now as a more mature adult. Unfortunately, my TARDIS is in the shop.
Stash said that she detected ghosts who were practical jokers. Sailors back in the World War II era could be pretty rowdy with their humor, probably today still too, and it wouldn't always fit with modern sensibilities about what appropriate forms of humor are between men and women.
That's true. For example, back in the 1940s, startling a woman by pinching or poking her on the bottom, or goosing her as it was known, used to be considered an innocent form of humorous play in society. In today's highly sensitive society, it would not be, but back then, people didn't look at it that way. It was considered a harmless practical joke. Now, if you have a practical joke of any sort played on you, you might not like it, but it wasn't considered a big deal. I once saw a clip of the dignified astronomer J. Allen Hynek note that if you were in a restaurant and wanted to see flying saucers, goose the waitress. I've also seen an episode of Murder, She Wrote from the 1980s where the ultra-dignified Angela Lansbury was goosed, and her character made a look but didn't treat this as any big deal. Well, there have been some reports that the sailor ghosts did this to women visitors to the ship. I haven't heard Stash comment on this particular thing, but in general, she hadn't found it a problem being a woman around all these World War II male ghosts. So, in fact, she says it's quite the contrary.
Being a female psychic amongst so many male ghosts is a lot of fun. I'm certainly enjoying it. That's a special opportunity that I really enjoy. But they seem to be respectful, playful, respectful, but it's certainly a different dynamic. Sometimes I suppose it might be an issue, but I haven't found it to be one.
However, even though Stash and many of the workers on the Hornet perceive the ghosts as friendly, some people, living people, have been scared of them.
There are some people that are afraid of the ghosts. Now, there were 2 other psychics that came on board, and they were frightened with the spirits or energies that they detected in the lower decks of the ship. And I think it's because they're really not, as I say, the spirits aren't necessarily to be frightened of. My interpretation is that the spirits themselves are frightened, so they're picking up on the terror and the energy. It still doesn't mean that, to take it lightly. You have to proceed with care and caution and be very careful, but with understanding and with patience and a level of communication, you can interact with some of these spirits. I myself knew immediately when I came on board that I had to go down to the depths of the ship and feel the belly of the ship. I was compelled to, because I knew there was a lot of activity. And I also felt that I had to go up to the flight deck in the bridge area, because there was a lot of activity up there. I could see the Admiral was overseeing things from there, the captain of the ship. And I have been fortunate enough to have those experiences to be able to go down to the bottom and the top. And there are some other people that are somewhat concerned, but in general, most people do view the ghosts as a friendly and happy bunch.
So Stash believes that the ghosts, or most of them, are friendly and happy. However, she thinks that some of the ghosts are afraid. And if I understand her correctly, she means that if you're afraid of the ghosts, they may pick up on that fear, and it may cause some of them to be afraid. For example, here she describes one particular ghost that she sensed to have fear-related issues. In this clip, Stash mentions that some of the naval customs that are performed when a ship crosses the equator, which she refers to as crossing the border, were disturbing for this individual.
In the forecastle area, there's a spirit I picked up immediately. That one is more frightened, and I pick up that he did not even want to be in the service. He was frightened. He's definitely someone who has a more intellectual, quiet type of a mind. He was a loner in his civilian life, and coming on board, having no privacy, and dealing with the fears and terrors of being under attack was just traumatizing for him. Even some of the fraternity activities, such as crossing the border, that the Navy takes seriously, but is not, it's more like a fraternity hazing. He couldn't stand any of it. He was frightened, and I have sensed that he's still that way, and he's stuck here because he was in an unfortunate accident and lost his life in that area of the ship, and he just got stuck in terror. He was not one to believe in God, so he hasn't gone on to the light. Now, when there's folks that come up, he is offended and afraid, mostly out of almost a paranoia or a fear, and as a result, he's stuck. He's stuck there.
So she indicates that this ghost died in an accident, which happened after a lot of psychological stress from being in the military in wartime, and now he's stuck on the ship. He didn't believe in God during his life, but he seemingly died in God's friendship anyway, which is possible. He apparently needs to work through some serious issues before he can move on. Elsewhere, in an article she wrote titled USS Hornet Ghost Stories, Stash wrote this summary about the ghosts, and she reports this about the same individual who she reports manifesting in the Junior Officer Board, or JOB.
This spirit is one of the commonest ones for visitors to be able to sense. His presence is very strong, and he really does not like others near his space. Some who have tried to sleep here have felt their leg pushed off the lower bunk.
But most of the ghosts aren't in his condition and aren't dealing with these kinds of issues.
I could pick up that there were some of the souls on this ship were frightened and dealing with more of a tormented state. But most of them in general, whether they died in combat on the ship or whatever, or later in civilian life, most of the spirits came back by choice to help in preserving the Hornet legacy. That was very clear.
Stash indicates that most of the ghosts are not so-called stuck souls that are in an early stage of their journey in the afterlife. Instead, in this case, Stash says,
the Hornet ghosts are not like this. They know they are dead. Indeed, the vast majority have already completed their transition, moved on to the light, and come back again by choice. Furthermore, they interact with each other and still follow the chain of command, starting at the top with the ghost of Admiral J.J. Clark. Perhaps because of this, they tend to be happy and well-adjusted spirits, often playful, and sometimes downright helpful in their interactions with the living. They seem to accept those who regularly work on the ship as crew, and therefore one of them, and enjoy having children around.
And indeed, many of the interactions with the ghosts are seen as positive and supportive. For example, here's Keith Ledoux, who believes that the Admiral has been looking out for him and protecting him.
I did a great deal of painting up in the island superstructure, and the whole time I was up there, I really felt that someone was watching me. And it was, it's more like a flag rank kind of officer. I had that kind of feeling someone very important that had a lot to do with history was up there just making sure I was taking care of his ship. So it's not a scary feeling, it's kind of a special feeling. You feel protected, and like it helps you, because that was hard work, and it kind of helped keep me going. I have a goal in my mind, I have a picture of what it's going to look like, the end result, and some of these presents are here helping us do it. They're making sure it's done right.
This is not to say that the ghosts don't also want a certain amount of privacy. For example, Ron Todd reports that there is one area of the ship which he feels the ghosts don't really want to be disturbed, that they consider it their space.
There's a passageway that leads from the hangar bay on the port side going to the forecastle. And it's about halfway down that passageway that there is a very strong presence. And I don't know whether it's one individual or several, but the presence is so strong that it makes me very uncomfortable. It's beginning right here. The hairs on my arms are standing up. It's right in here. Very, very strong. That it's not frightening, but it's definitely that he or they do not want you in this area. And yet, oh, it's strong here too. And yet here, in the forecastle, it disappears. There's nothing. When I have gone there, I've moved through the area very quickly. But just to take care of that, when I do lead hangar bay tours to the forecastle, I go up the starboard side passageway, and there is no presence at all. So respecting their feelings that they don't want us there or want it to be disturbed, I respect that, and I go up the starboard side.
Normally when a ghost appears, it's only a single ghost, but here it sounds like there's a whole community. Have the psychics and others formulated any theories about what the ghosts are doing on board the Hornet?
Stash touched on this towards the end of one of the clips that we heard, but here she goes into more depth about what she perceives.
The sense of and purpose of the spirits being here, clearly to me, is to help and facilitate in preserving the Hornet and her legacy. They're very proud of what they have done on here, and in the past, the history, and this ship was about to be sold for scrap at $6 per ton. So it was a lot of work to save it and have a historical museum to share information and history of what went on.
And this is something that Bob Rogers concurs with. When this interview was filmed in 1999, the National Hornet Foundation had just been able to obtain the ship from the Navy and save it. And he feels that the ghost definitely helped with that effort.
Well, first of all, I absolutely believe they're here. I have felt them on a number of occasions now. I become aware of them in the office here at times. I personally like the ghosts, and I feel very comfortable with them. And I'm sure they've helped us through the saving of the ship to bring the ship back to be a museum and a national treasure, and to show herself off and to tell the history of not only Hornet but the United States, and of that, particularly the time period that she was active on active duty.
And according to reports, the ghosts aren't just helping the living, they're also helping each other. Speaking of herself in the third person, Stash writes,
a few of the ghosts appear to have been identified. One of these is that of Admiral J.J. Clark. Stash also felt some details about the chaplain, that he was an Irish Roman Catholic with a last name starting with M and a nickname of Padre. She felt his presence was very much around, and that he was still working to help some of the stuck ghosts on the ship move on.
And if that's true, that would be a very interesting fact about the ghost community on the ship, where the former Catholic chaplain, being a ghost who quickly moved on in the afterlife and then came back, is helping the ghosts of other crew members who are still in the early stages and are somewhat stuck in those. That would mean that the chaplain is doing the afterlife equivalent of the same kind of ministry that Father Nathan Castle reports doing for stuck souls that reach out to him. We discussed Father Castle and his ministry to stuck souls in episode 269 and again in episode 270, so you can go to mysterious.fm/269 and mysterious.fm/270 to hear about that.
A lot of what we've been hearing about in this segment of the show is what psychics like Stash Margaret Murray have perceived. But is there any physical sign that ghosts are on board? Has anyone tried to use equipment to detect them?
This is something that you see happening a lot on ghost hunting TV shows, where people will wave around electronic devices like tri-field meters and claim that they're detecting ghosts. But this is something actual paranormal investigators are much more careful about, because ghosts are not electromagnetic in nature. If they were, we would have positive proof of them and they wouldn't be controversial, because we have really good electromagnetic sensing equipment and they would appear on that equipment all the time, making them easy to study. But we don't have that kind of evidence, which means that ghosts are not an electromagnetic phenomenon. So electromagnetic sensors are simply not capable of detecting ghosts. But that doesn't mean that ghosts can't influence them. Parapsychologists report laboratory experiments in which living people seem to have a degree of psychokinesis, or mind over matter. And if living people have that, then you'd expect deceased people to have it too. Consequently, if you have reason to believe that ghosts are appearing in an area, you could ask them to influence the electronic equipment with psychokinesis, and they might do so. This is something that paranormal investigators sometimes do, and they do sometimes get anomalous instrument readings in the same place that witnesses have been perceiving ghosts. When that happens, it's significant, but you need both things. An anomalous reading on an instrument doesn't tell you that it's produced by a ghost. It's just an anomalous reading, and those happen all the time for all kinds of reasons. But if you get an anomalous instrument reading coupled with witness perceptions of ghosts, then that has more significance. And that has been done on the Hornet. In her article, Stash writes about Ready Room 1 on the gallery deck of the ship, and she says,
"There are usually several spirits dressed in flight suits with their parachutes on in this room. Trifield meters, which measure electromagnetic fields, which some associate with ghosts, set up in this room have gone off the scale."
So here we have a case where there are anomalous readings in conjunction with witness perceptions.
Of course, not everyone believes in ghosts, so not everybody's going to believe that they're actually on the Hornet. What kind of relationship do the believers and the skeptics have?
In the main, the relationship between the skeptics and the believers seems to be okay. Stash comments about how the believers have tried to be respectful of the skeptics and how even many of the skeptics have had their own unusual experiences, even if they're not prepared to attribute them to ghosts.
We have been somewhat careful about the issue of having a psychic on board because there are some skeptics, and there's certainly, this is a military environment that may not be so open to that idea. However, over time, many of the skeptics have had experiences, and whether they believe or not, because of those experiences, they're at least open to hearing about what the others have experienced and open to having a psychic around.
And Bob Rogers comments on how many people have had unusual experiences on the ship, whether or not they understand them as being due to ghosts.
Yes, there are skeptics, but there are a lot of people that believe there are spirits on this ship. And there are, I couldn't tell you the number of people that have had, I couldn't tell you the number of incidents, but I bet there's 30 or 40 people that have had experiences one way or the other. Some are just hearing sounds or unusual things occurring. I know of another sighting that occurred with two people seeing the ghost at the same time. And again, it was an officer. And there were several other sightings of enlisted men and officers that I know of. So there's a number of people around that are very convinced, as I am, that they are here. On the other hand, there are skeptics and even some of the people, it's rather interesting, that have seen a ghost weren't quite ready to accept it.
So that's a basic summary of what's been reported aboard the USS Hornet, at least up to 1999. What we're going to do next episode is talk to Lloyd Auerbach, one of the key paranormal investigators who has looked at the situation on the ship as we move into the faith and reason perspectives.
And until then, what further resources can we offer to the listeners and viewers?
We'll have a link to Lloyd Auerbach's book, A Paranormal Casebook, where he talks about the Hornet. We'll also have a link to the USS Hornet website, and you can set up a visit for yourself. They even have overnight visits sometimes. We'll have information about the Hornet 8 and the Hornet 12 and video of about the Hornet 8 being sunk. We'll have the Hornet Museum's YouTube page, as well as video of that 1944 emergency landing on the Hornet, info on J.J. Clark, the Apollo 11 splashdown, and the Apollo 12 splashdown.
Very good. And now it's time to hear from you. What are your theories about the USS Hornet, its amazing history, and the ghosts that are reportedly aboard it? Let us know by visiting sqpn.com or the Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World Facebook page, sending us an email to feedback@mysterious.fm, sending a tweet to @MYS_world, visiting the StarQuest Discord community at sqpn.com/discord, or calling our mysterious feedback line at 619-738-4515. That's 619-738-4515.
And I want to say a special word of thanks to Oasis Studio 7 for the video and animation work they did on this episode. You can check it out. And, with these clips and stuff today, including the historical ones, it's a fairly visual episode. So do check it out at youtube.com/Jimmy Akin. I'm also trying at the time we're recording this to try to get up to 100,000 subscribers, at which point I hope the YouTube algorithm will treat the channel with a little more respect and share it with other folks. So you can help me get there by liking, commenting, writing a review, or sharing the podcast, and especially if you subscribe to it. And when you do that, be sure and hit the bell notification so you always get notified when I have a new video. I also want to say a special thanks to parapsychologist Lloyd Auerbach of the Office of Paranormal Investigations. He was the one who introduced me to the fascinating story of the USS Hornet, and he was the one who provided the video clips of the Hornet that we've been watching in this episode, where witnesses describe their experiences.
I also want to thank Anna Fontaine for her voiceover work on this episode. So, Jimmy, what's our next episode going to be about?
Next week, we're going to be talking with Lloyd Auerbach about the paranormal investigations that he's done aboard the USS Hornet, and then we'll take a look at them from the faith and reason perspectives.
Folks, be sure to follow Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, TuneIn, your favorite podcast app, or, like you said, at Jimmy's YouTube channel, where you should hit the bell to get notifications and definitely subscribe. Get your very own Mysterious World t-shirt, mug, and more in our merchandise shop at sqpn.com/merch. You'll find links to Jimmy's resources from our discussion on our show notes at mysterious.fm/352. And remember, to help us continue to produce the podcast, please visit sqpn.com/give. Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is also brought to you in part by Rosary Army, featuring award-winning Catholic podcasts, rosary resources, videos, and the School of Mary online community, prayer, and learning platform. Learn how to make them, pray them, and give them away while growing in your faith at rosaryarmy.com and schoolofmary.com. Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is also brought to you in part through the generous support of Aaron Vergeson Electric and Automation, making connections for life for your automation and smart home needs in North and Central Florida at aaronv.com. Until next time, Jimmy Akin, thank you for exploring with us our mysterious world.
Thanks, Dom.
And once again, I'm Dom Bettinelli. Thank you for listening to Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World on StarQuest.